A term that we haven't used too much so far is the term of information technology. When we are talking about digital stuff, it usually has to do with what we today call IT, information technology, and this is part of a much larger concept that we are part of, which is has been called the information age by Manuel Castells in the 90s. Among information technologies, he says they include, like everybody else, the converging set of technologies in microelectronics, computing, machines and software, telecommunications, broadcasting, and optoelectronics. In addition, unlike some analysts, I also include in the realm of information technologies genetic engineering and an expanding set of developments and applications. This is not only because genetic engineering is focused on the decoding, manipulation, and eventual reprogramming of the information codes of living matter, but also because biology, electronics, and informatics seem to be converging and interacting in their applications, in their materials, and more fundamentally in their conceptual approach. Now, it is obviously a strange leap to make in terms of what we are thinking of the digital, but based on last week's conversation about the effect of digital technologies on our bodies and our daily lives, it is not so much of a jump in conclusions to find that the manipulation of human genetic material is a matter of a digital technology, and as much as we are taking data, that is the data of our DNA and our genes, and modifying it in the same way that we are modifying computer code in other places. Of course, at this point in time, there is not that much of a result to these manipulations, even though it was a very pressing matter for a lot of people in the 90s because it was kind of this fear that a lot of people had that genetic manipulation could create very quickly new mutant individuals, mutant sheep, and other kinds of weird creations. And we are certainly not sheltered from this. This is a real possibility that something could go wrong in a way that would possibly create our worst nightmares. But there is also quite a bit of leeway for us to make those extremely complicated machines that are the human bodies into something even halfway functional. That being said, since we have the possibility of affecting our bodies at an atomic or molecular level using this technology, it is an interesting way to think of how much this kind of experiment could affect our daily lives, and especially if we start to connect those machines to the internet, assuming that we can change the human genetic material at a very small level, and we have gene editing right now, would it be possible to connect these genes the same way that we are connecting individual computers? The bigger concern here is something that Henry Jenkins, who we have mentioned before, seems to call transmedia storytelling, because we are connecting a whole lot of data, a whole lot of information, since we are talking about the information age, and a whole lot of points that seem to be, in fact, not so much connected in reality, but could, in our imagination, be connected through very distant leaps. Transmedia storytelling refers to a new aesthetic that has emerged in response to media convergence, one that places new demands on consumers and depends on the active participation of knowledge communities. Transmedia storytelling is the art of world making. To fully experience any fictional world, consumers must assume the role of hunters and gatherers, chasing bits of the story down across media channels, comparing notes with each other via online discussion groups, and collaborating to ensure that everyone who invests time and effort will come away with a richer entertainment experience. Some would argue that the Wachowskis, who wrote and directed the three Matrix films, have pushed transmedia storytelling farther than most audience members were prepared to go. Now, in the context of the Matrix that we are going to talk about in a second, there is somewhat of a cryptic element that is involved in it. And if you know anything about the Matrix, including the newer movie that came out more recently, the idea is that there is this computer programming that is allowing for the world to function in a certain way, and the possibility for some people to somewhat escape that computer generation and to see the reality of it, sometimes to cross from one reality to the other. Hence, this idea of a transmedia media storytelling, that the same story can be told in essentially two different worlds, one that is computer generated, the other one that is not so much. But there is this still aspect of a place here that Jenkins is talking about, that transmedia storytelling is the art of world making, because this is the world that we are living in, where we have these apparently not so overlapping realities of things that are happening in one particular realm and things that are happening in a different realm on a different scale, maybe. That in some places, for example, on the East Coast, the legislation is done by the government, and on the West Coast, legislation is made by Silicon Valley, or whatever you want to think of it. This is a existing context that we have, and something that is very easily relatable once you put down all the pieces through the work that Jenkins is realizing here, that people will connect those dots through their conversations, perhaps whether or not these dots actually exist in the world that is created in the Matrix or in the digital world, whatever it might be. Now, in the context of understanding those different layers of our existence and whether or not they are separate layers in the software sense or if they are separate layers in an economic or political sense, and also the possibility of people connecting through these networks using a network that perhaps crosses through political economic boundaries, maybe even cross through personal identity boundaries. The possibility of telling a story across these worlds makes for a more compelling narrative. At least a compelling narrative that people may or may not understand. This particular cartoon here, dated from 2000, is showing people going out of the movie and saying, well, this is a great movie, or I didn't get it. Because this is this very real possibility that depending on your awareness of what is happening in the world, then you might have very different understandings of that movie. But these three friends coming out of the movie will get to talk about it, perhaps change each other's minds, perhaps get into a new form of understanding through that, maybe make weird no longer friends through their weird understandings of that movie. And so, in this context here, having this basic story with whatever narrative storytelling holes existing in it, the people who are able to use that fabric, tell that fabric into different worlds, maybe fill those gaps in knowledge that they have, or perhaps find new bits of information on the internet through the movie, will perhaps get to create their new story of what exactly it is that this movie is telling them about. What is the reality there? In that context, The Matrix being a piece of art is kind of a blank canvas on which people can present their fears or their hopes or whatever it is that animates them in a way, whether or not, again, the Wachowskis who made the movie intended it, and whether or not they are getting the right conversation out of it. Now, The Matrix itself, as you can see here, was advertised through these posters. So this is from 1999 of a cell phone that is disconnected, or um, the receiver for a phone that is not hooked up to the phone booth. Oof, it's a lot of weird words that I haven't used in a while. The telephone being the way that the main character Neo is using to communicate with the other parts of the world, and so Neo is a hacker, as it was the hot topic in the 90s, who becomes this kind of transmedia icon in the movie, gets pulled into a resistance movement to overturn these weird agents, quote unquote, and that's their name in the movie, who are trying to shape reality in specific ways that would perhaps deter people or maybe distract people get away from their more nefarious purposes. So here, Neo, this character that has a knowledge of the computer, is able to cross the boundaries between the worlds and to see the world as it really is compared to as it is presented to him. So, as a result of that, Neo has this kind of privileged place of being able to cross the worlds, but also this privileged place of being able to affect the world. That is done through a matter of taking pills that are provided to him that are somewhat of a drug, nootropic drug, or something of the sort, provided by a character with um, these mirror sunglasses here. This particular idea has been taken over pretty quickly by all kinds of groups who saw the coin, or sorry, getting ahead of myself, who saw the pills as a way to put an end to those weird narratives that are made around them. So this particular advertisement here from isnmoderncoins.com talking about well, gold essentially. You take the blue pill, story ends, you wake up in the bed and believe what you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and ISN will show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Hashtag buy gold, hashtag buy silver, hashtag save that middle class for some reason. Um, and of course, this is an advertisement to completely unrelated to what the story is about in the book, completely unrelated to anything you might think of in the book, in the movie, except for the idea that the pills are a way to show the reality as it quote unquote really is. Whether or not reality is real, of course, being a different part of this story. And so the larger understanding of the matrix has come to these understandings of, well, somebody out there is lying to you, somebody out there is creating a narrative to you, somebody has an agenda for you that you did not intend, and you have the possibility as a person with a sense of magic, with a sense of crossing media, to change that. This particular meme here, that life-changing moment when you start seeing the world for what it truly is, which is code, apparently, which is again generated by these nefarious people, and you as a person with that gift are able to change that. And of course, now that we are seeing the world as a thing connected to our computers, it is pretty evident to many of us that the world that we are currently living in has all of these new dimensions, if you will, all of these ways in which we are engaging in the world which did not exist for previous generation, in terms of our engagement with the media, for example, the possibility of commenting on things and connecting with other on things. We've talked about that in this class before. The possibility of persistence of the media. For example, when your newspaper was printed on paper, then you kind of had to hope that somebody had the right copy of the paper to see it. Now you can see articles on the internet that are dated from 10, 15, 20 years ago, plus the replication of the papers that had existed also 100 years ago that have been digitized and put on the internet. Everything is searchable, so you have the possibility to look for things at a much faster rate without having to do all of the legwork. It is also much more scalable because it is easily spread out throughout the world as opposed to being locally distributed without having to print out a million newspapers or a million books. It is also delocated because it is existing in a place as much as in no place. And it also is blurring the public and the private spheres, in that people of any sort can now print their news, can then make their own information about everything, and anyone who has a internet connection is able to access news from anyone and everyone, as opposed to back when you only had those news that were provided by the people that were um, rich enough, or perhaps clever enough to print them. So the larger narrative that exists in the Matrix here becomes one of people reconciling themselves with the world that they are living in, and whether they are able to navigate that world as individuals that are sleep walking through the world, or people who are willing to take those extra steps to cross those boundaries that are not otherwise acceptable. here from the matrix itself, your appearance is what we call residual self-image. In other words, Neo only looks like this because he thinks he looks like this, because he has this memory implanted in his brain of what the world looks like, as opposed to being lines of computer code. And of course, that world has extended far beyond the Matrix. For example, this poster for the series Stranger Things that was advertising through the Matrix kind of aesthetic of these lines of code and whether or not those stories are legible. And those stories or these points are commendable from one person or place to the other. The possibility of conjuring these ideas, conjuring that story through this particular imagery makes the transmedia system here do a lot of work for us, because this particular series echoes a particular movie that echoes a particular image that echoes a particular quest or whatever, which again, once you connect those dots and you make those leaps that are more or less feasible or more or less accessible, then you get a whole lot more from the story from understanding it, allegedly, perhaps. And this is something that is very much what the internet runs on at this point in time. The possibility of just dropping hints of things, and that much is the functioning of QAnon that we have mentioned previously in this class, and the functioning of what you might see in other memes as well. This is how the memes are connecting people and how this quote unquote meme magic is working, as this particular um, advertising here for Jiddu Krishnamurti. What is the matrix? Obviously, it is the brain, says the poster. Now, of course, as part of a much larger context, this is a quotation that was made in 1971, before the Matrix, before our understanding of what the Matrix even would be. What is the material upon which experience leaves a mark? Is there such material? Now, what is it on which any experience leaves a mark? Obviously, it is the brain. The fact is, the brain is the material. The cells are the material on which every incident leaves a mark. It's free experience, conscious or unconscious. All the time, the brain is receiving. I see that flower, it is already registered. I see you, it has already registered. Constant recording is going on. It is there. The racial inheritance, the personal inheritance, all this is leaving a mark on the brain. And in as much as we can remember things, we can see things or even perceive things as this residual self-image, as the movie mentions, it is clear that the way in which we are making this connection is just a matter of our brain making connections with things that may or may not be more or less related. And if the matrix is simply the brain and the weird connections that exist are made by our brain, perhaps conditioned by a greater narrative that exists or doesn't exist, or that is more or less uh, fashioned into specific ways, then our understanding of how those connections are made is a matter of our brain making the work or doing the work for us in ways that we are more or less in control of. Maybe using specific kinds of drugs would allow us to do so. Maybe having a sense of spiritual self-discovery, as Neo does in the movie, also might do that work. But this is definitely something that would be understandable in broader terms rather than the specifics of this is how the Matrix was working. Jiddu Krishnamurti died in 1986, so none of this conversation was particularly relevant to him. Again, really predating all of these conversations on the information age. However, if we just think of the brain and the information it stores, then certainly this is nothing new and nothing specific to this digital context we are thinking about.